Hello and welcome to Adventures in Visibility. I've got a quick question for you, and that is, do you struggle with how to make your business stand out amongst all the other businesses that are, competing for the same clients and customers as you? Because I know I do, and that's why we're here today. I'm Denise Wakeman, your guide and host of Adventures in Visibility and how to get more visibility on the web. And today we're going to be talking about how to use storytelling and metaphors to make your story stand out. As human beings, we've been telling stories since the dawn of time. It started out visually with pictures, like on the caves in France. I'm not even going to try to pronounce the name because I know I will say it wrong. But we've been doing it since then, and then, with the dawn of written content, written word, we've been telling stories since then. So it's a part of our inherent beings to tell stories, but the key is, the challenge is, at least for me, is how do you tell a story that gets attention and that stands out and that makes connections and engagement. So because I struggle there, I invited two expert storytellers to join us today on Adventures in Visibility. And I am so grateful that these two wonderful people said yes, because I had been asking around for a while. Then it was like, duh, I know two people. They're in my communities in one way or another. Like, hello, Denise, where have you been? So I invited Michael Kass and Téa Silvestre Godfrey to join me today. And they are both wonderful storytellers, and they also, it's part of their business. It is their business to help others, like business owners, entrepreneurs, and leaders, to tell their stories. So you're going to learn how and why to share your personal story, your personal business and business stories, how to use metaphors, and how to tell better stories so that you do get that attention and connection you want. Before I introduce my two guests, I just want to give you a little bit of admin stuff here. At any time during the interview, if you have questions, you can go ahead and type them in the chat on the side. And if you feel so inclined, I would be most grateful if you would, on the other side of your screen, click the share last 30 seconds button. It used to be, share a tweet, but now it's share last 30 seconds. It makes a little GIF, or whatever you want to call it, that you can share to Twitter. So I would love it if you would do that so we can get the word out about what these two fabulous storytellers are talking about with us today. So Michael and Téa, welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here. I am so excited. You can't believe how excited I am. But I want to start the conversation with getting a little bit of your backgrounds. Instead of me just reading, the bio, I'd like to hear from both of you just quickly, like how you got involved in this storytelling thing, and helping others tell their story. So Téa, do you want to kick off?
Sure. How's my sound?
Great.
Awesome. Okay. Well, I've always loved stories. I was an English major. I wrote, very melodramatic poetry when I was a teenager. And it just kind of morphed into, what do you do with a love of pictures and stories? You go into marketing, right? Because that's what it is. And as I progressed through my career, I was in marketing for 25 plus years. I kind of made a full circle back around to when I was in college, which was studying stories and the storytelling method. And that's really where my love is. It's not really about marketing for me, but I was making it work. So that's how I got involved in it.
Okay, excellent. And Michael?
It's a great question. So I was talking to my parents last weekend, and I realized when I was 8 years old, I apparently had this big book of fairy tales, and I turned to my mom and I went, all I want to do is study how these stories influence the way that people see the world. I probably said it less coherently than that, but that was, so story has always been something that's in my life, and that turned up as acting for a long time. I have a master's in theater, and I kind of burned out on that and turned to performance storytelling, things like The Moth, any number of other podcasts. And about 5 years ago, I had quit my job and was like, what am I going to do with my life? I'm very sad. And I found myself at a dinner party and just sort of floated. I made up a business kind of on the spot because it was very fancy social impact entrepreneurs who were working with like the White House and other big things that I had no business being at this dinner party. And I introduced myself and literally I'd never said it to anyone before. I went, hey, I'm Michael. I help people discover and harness the power of their stories to create change. And everybody got so excited. They were like, what? We need you. Do you have a business card? Which I didn't because I made it up. So I went home, I made a website and have been sort of growing that business and exploring it ever since. But Téa, I agree. Like, I'm not a marketing person. I'm a storytelling person. And it so happens that storytelling's probably the most powerful tool you could possibly have for marketing and visibility.
Yeah, and that's, I think that's, as I said at the beginning, it's a huge struggle. And I know if I'm struggling with it, others are struggling with it. And, we want our business to stand out. We want to attract the right people. We don't want to be boring, but, I'm a really pragmatic, linear thinker. And so to turn that into something that's more interesting, I find like I have a really hard time with that. And so, and here we are. So let's start with, or move to the next question I have is like, why should we be telling stories? So why should, leaders like who you were connected with, Michael, and marketers, business owners, entrepreneurs, big businesses, little businesses, why should we be telling stories?
Our brains are just wired that way. We communicate, we remember things better, we are more interested and engaged when we're using stories to talk to each other.
Yeah.
That's it. It's just makes your life easier. So,
yeah.
Go
And
ahead.
to build on that, I think it's part of our elemental humanity. And there's all sorts of, for those who are left-brained, amazing research out there now that shows that if as a leader, you approach someone and you start sharing like a spreadsheet with them, or you lead with facts and ideas, there's one specific part of the brain that lights up, right? It's the part that's responsible for processing information. If you tell a story, like the one I told about being at the dinner, right? And coming up with that thing, what happens is your brains start to sync up with mine, and they are engaging all over the place. So as a leader or a business owner, what we want to do is we want to engage the whole person, not just the part that's responsible for processing information. And so, yeah, I mean, we're tapping into something that is, Téa, like you said, so hardwired into our DNA that nothing else can quite replicate.
The other thing that's important too to remember is that if we don't tell the story, the person that's receiving whatever we're saying is going to make up their own story.
That's right.
So, this is how stuff gets off track, right?
Yeah.
So you want to make sure that if you're communicating well, that you are in kind of leading the story that you want to be told or received, because the other person or the other people, if they don't have a story, they're going to start making it up.
Right.
Okay, everybody, I want props for that, because that's so important to remember. If you don't tell your story, somebody else will make up a different story about you. So thank you. Sorry, Michael, I interrupted you.
No, I was just going to build on that. I think that if you give people data points, they'll create a story based on their previous experience of the world. And so it's your responsibility as a, business person, leader, or just human in the world to meet people where they're at. And I work with a lot of nonprofits, and this is a huge thing for them because they live in this world where their mission is so important. And a large part of my work with them is helping them realize, hey, nobody else cares. So you have to make them care. If you don't, they're not going to.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, we got some pithy things going on here. And when you said that, it made me realize, like, just connecting to the nonprofit piece, is that when I lived in Ottawa, we were talking about that I lived in Canada before we went live here. And when I lived in Ottawa, there was a big display in a big public park, and it was with Doctors Without Borders. And what they did is they created a refugee camp and told their story that way. I mean, and you could like taste the, food that people who are in refugee camps, I mean, it's got all the proteins and, nutrition and stuff, but how bad it is and how much water and what they have to sleep on, all that stuff. They told the story. Now that was experiential, but, there was lots of, content too. And from that moment on, and this was like a long time ago, like 16 years ago, maybe, I have been a monthly donor to Doctors Without Borders because they told a story that I was crying, as I was experiencing it. And so, they made me care, which is exactly what you're saying. Whoever came up with telling the story experientially. So that was thank you. Yeah. I don't know if I went off base there or not.
No, but that's a great example of why because it sticks with you. This was years ago.
Yeah.
When we tell a story, you can't forget it if it gets in there and it resonates. Whereas I don't remember any of the facts I learned in school, but I remember some of the stories.
Yeah.
And so when you're looking to make an impact, that's the way to do it.
Okay, so that's great. Now we need to know how to tell those stories because that's okay. We all say yes. Okay, I get it. We should be telling stories about our business and about ourselves, but how do I do that? How do I'm not a writer. I'm not a storyteller. How do I do that? So let's break that open a little bit.
So, I mean, I want to redefine terms. Like you actually are, everybody's a storyteller. You have to, like, we wouldn't be here if we weren't, we like evolutionarily, the people who didn't tell and respond to stories didn't reproduce. So by definition, we're all storytellers. And that's, there's all sorts of fun. There's amazing scientific reasons for that. One of which is that story releases oxytocin, which is the hormone responsible for essentially creating a sense of tribe. And so the people who didn't tribe up got eaten by tigers. Not all of them got eaten by tigers. Some of them got eaten by other animals, but they didn't make it. Yeah. So they didn't reproduce, right? So we're all storytellers. That's where I wanted to start. Téa, do you want to talk a little bit about?
No, I think it's really important for everybody to understand that because, there's a tendency for sure, like Denise said, I'm a pragmatic, logical thinker. I don't know how to tell stories. Right. And so you'll dismiss your abilities out of hand without even thinking about all the stories that you tell, not to other people even, but to yourself all day long, right? I have a story about what I'm able to do or accomplish today. I have a story about that person who came to my door and messed up my day, or, you know what I mean? Like we make up stories all the time. So you have the ability, Denise. Right. There's no doubt about that. Yeah. And really, being able to tell a good, engaging story, you have to think about it, especially if you're a business person or a leader who's going to be telling a story over time, many times over, pieces here, pieces there, that you have to keep in mind the attention span of your audience, right? If my grandmother tries to tell me what her day was like, she goes all around the whole thing. There's like no point, and I finally have to say, Grandma, really, like, what are you trying to tell me? Oh, she's just trying to tell me what her neighbor thought, and there's no point. So make sure you have a point every time you say something, right? And if you want to make it engaging, then it has to be about your audience and not about you.
Right. Yeah.
Because we don't necessarily.
That's a really good thing too, because so I get a lot of pushback sometimes. Well, I don't want to be a narcissist. The story's all about me. But if you're doing it right, it's really about connecting with your audience and letting them hear what they need to know. in order to do X, right? And so I would add what Téa said. It's not just about knowing your audience and what they need to hear. It's also, what do you want them to do? What action, and this is particularly for leaders or business owners, it's like, what do you want them to do at the end of the story? Do you want them to click something? Do you want them to give you a hug? Like, it doesn't matter what it is. But before you even start the story, knowing who you're speaking with and what you want them to do, then you can sort of reverse engineer the story to get you there. All of which, what we're doing, I think, is talking around your question right now, because it's a very concrete question. Like, how do we tell a good story?
Yeah. Well, I know, one of the ways that I, approached you guys about this was that, I'm really interested in how to use metaphor and how do you figure out what metaphors you want to use in your story so that you can make that connection. Because I know intellectually that metaphors are, help us tell a story. But it's like, how do you figure them out? So let's talk a little bit about metaphors and how do you come up with them, or how do you help people tap into the right metaphors for their story?
I have lots to say about that, but I don't want to hog the conversation. Do you want to, should we define for people first what a metaphor is? Just because,
that would be a good idea. Yeah.
Yeah. Michael, I'm going to see if you have a better definition, but
okay.
When you're in school, they teach you about metaphors and similes and what other aphorisms, and like there's all this like basket of words that we use to describe when we're talking about one thing, but we're using another thing to say what that is, right? Mm-hmm. So in terms of metaphors for your marketing, for your business, for your leadership, if you know that you have a brand that you're trying to build up and reinforce in people's minds, what is that brand about? Right? What is the big overarching theme that you are trying to portray? So I'll give you an example. In my business is called Story Bistro. And I use the metaphor of cooking and eating as a way to talk about marketing. Because for me, marketing is about relationships and connection with people, and so is eating and cooking and food and all that other stuff. So you want to find what is the thing that is like the thing that you're trying to talk about that is also super relevant to you and what your values are and what you're about. For me, the most important thing of all the things that I do in life is relationships. And so eating together with people is like the perfect metaphor for that. Because we sit around the table, we talk and we tell stories, and we build tribe, we build family, community.
Right. You tribe up.
Exactly.
Yeah. I love that metaphor. And I think I've told you this today. I love the metaphor of, are you guys getting echo on me, or is it just me?
Yeah, I think it's coming through Téa. I just muted her to.
Let's see.
While you're talking.
Okay, cool. So I love your metaphor of the Story Bistro, because, and it's interesting, right? When you unpack it, I'm like, yeah, that's what everybody says, right? But when you say Story Bistro, it's so evocative. And I think the metaphors have this incredible power to create emotion and to create affinity that a simple factual explanation doesn't. And I think, to build on what Téa said, if you go with the metaphors that will that are both authentic to you and will resonate with your audience, right? So Story Bistro isn't going to attract all of the people, but it's going to attract the kind of people that Téa probably wants to work with, right? I'm gonna bring him up. I was talking with John Leland about Donald Trump today and about the idea of this wall, which, dude's not going to build a wall, but it's a tremendously powerful metaphor because by saying wall, suddenly he's evoking a sense of safety. He's evoking a sense of we need to protect ourselves. He's evoking all of this with a single metaphor. And at the same token, when we call Trump a dumpster fire, that's another, we're moving through a world. I think Scott, you said it in the chat that we actually understand the world through metaphor. It's not through facts. It's through all of this. And so I don't know that I have a methodology for arriving at the right metaphor. What I'll usually do is work with people through their stories and help them realize that they're already using metaphor, that it's all in there, and it's just a question of teasing it out and bringing a little bit more awareness to it.
Okay.
That's absolutely true. Everybody's already doing it. And there's the story type assessment, Denise, that you took on my website, which will help you like realize the stuff that you're already doing. And if you remember that, to build on what Michael said, the metaphor is shorthand, right? Because it's something that we all kind of agree on. When I say eating together around a table, we pretty much all have had that experience. So, and that experience, that memory is loaded with sensory information and emotional information and all kinds of stuff that we can, like just by saying eating around the table, you could write like 12 pages of stuff that goes with that. So that's when I say shorthand, right? Like the shorthand of, or say it, Denise, you could speak it, right? You could talk about your experiences. That's what I'm trying to get at. Yeah. It's that you have that much information in your brain, and so does the other person. And so that is the shorthand. And that's why we want to use metaphor, because it's faster. It gets people to understand what we're saying faster. And like Michael said, you know, right now with all the stuff that's going on politically and otherwise, if you look on Facebook, everybody's coming up with metaphors and analogies of, well, if you don't understand what Black Lives Matters means, think about it this way, right? How many different examples have you seen in the last 3 days that will help people understand? And it's basically by using a different idea to talk about another idea. And now, whether or not that changes people's minds is a different story, but that's what we try to do.
Right.
Well, and I think to build on that, there's an interesting thing that happens with metaphor, which is if somebody buys into a certain metaphor or a certain story, then coming at it with facts isn't going to change the metaphor, right? And so combating somebody who believes that Black lives don't matter by saying, but they do, and here are the statistics, isn't going to work. What does work is helping them switch over to a different metaphor and a different story. And that's where a lot of this power is, right? Especially with businesses. If you are trying to convince people of the value of what you do, simply citing statistics that say, well, 47% of people are good storytellers or whatever, if they don't think that what you do has value, that won't penetrate. But what will penetrate is a story or a metaphor that shows the value of the service, right? I remember, this happened a lot around gay marriage, right? People had a certain story in their mind around what that represented. But then they would meet someone, and there were these beautiful videos that went viral and all this stuff about, oh, wait, but you're a person, you're great, and then all of a sudden their core belief has to shift in order to make sense of this new world that they're experiencing.
Right. Okay. Yeah. I love all those examples. I don't know. Are those metaphors?
They can be. Yeah. I mean, metaphor it doesn't have to be symbolic. And, there's another level at which metaphor works, which is it can tap into this collective unconscious or collective mythology, right? So Superman is a metaphor. If I say Superman, anybody in the US suddenly knows what I'm talking about, right? Superwoman. Well, she's a superwoman, right?
Superpowers. Right. What are your superpowers?
Right. What's your, yeah, exactly. All of that. So there are these collective metaphors that we can also tap into.
Okay. So as a business owner, I know that I need to, be more of a storyteller versus a data teller. So you said that, both of you said that you tease it out when you're working with clients. So can you give us, share just a little bit about how you would go about doing that? Because it's like, that's the thing. It's like,
yeah. I mean,
coming up with it, like sitting here by myself, I'm like, I don't know. I mean, I've sort of worked on it with my adventures theme, that I moved my brand into, but for everybody else.
Yeah. So here's an example. I worked with a guy who is a consultant and mentor for small businesses. And he's a data head, and he's been doing this. He's probably in his 60s. He loves his data, and he's amazing at it. He can talk about these complex constructs for growth. And he was realizing that people were glazing over when he was talking, even though he was, he's engaging, he's all of that. And I said, well, why don't you just tell me a story about a time you wanted something in your life? Doesn't matter what it is. And he told a story about, he was 8 years old and he wanted a pair of shoes. And I'm like, that's a stupid story. I don't care. But I didn't say that internally. I'm like, oh boy, maybe this isn't going to work this time. But then we started exploring it, and it ended up that he wanted those shoes because he was kind of a kid who he wasn't well to do. He was from the wrong side of the tracks, metaphor. And he wanted to fit in with the rich kids, and they all had shoes like the ones he wanted. So the shoes actually weren't shoes. They were a metaphor for upward mobility, for social growth, for moving into a new way of being in the world, right? And as soon as we tapped into that, we realized, and that's exactly what you do with your clients now. You help them move from a place of not having much business or they're at a certain stage of growth, and he basically gives them new shoes to help them move in a different way in the world. Ultimately, so that's what it looks like. And what's fascinating is it never fails, because everything in everybody's life is connected to everything else in their life. So it actually doesn't matter where you start. You just find a thread and you follow that thread. And if you follow it down enough, you'll get to the core that drives that person. Whether it's in business or personal. I just made it sound very easy, but it takes some doing sometimes.
Well, it sounds like it's helpful to have somebody to, help ask the questions.
You need it. It's essential, but because there's a lot of resistance to penetrating down to that level a lot of times, because we're not used to doing it, especially in the modern society. We tend to stay up at this level. It's very safe up here,
Yeah.
And not that it's any less safe down there. We're just not used to going to that core level. So having somebody like Téa or me is pretty powerful.
So Téa, what's your process like?
Well, like Michael said, what you're trying to do is you're trying to find the starting point. In my work, the starting point is the brand and understanding what the brand is about. So if you can get yourself, or you can get someone to ask you questions about things like, what is your big why? Talk about that for a minute. Tell me a story about why this is important to you. I did this with a client who is a nonprofit consultant. I said, why do you do what you do? And she told me a story about when she was a kid, they were in the backyard as kids, digging around as kids do, and she found an arrowhead in the backyard. And that led to, well, what is this? And she learned all about the Native Americans. And, there was this big whole world that opened up to her in terms of what America means in terms of Native Americans and how we've treated them, and, that they needed help. And she went to the museum, and it became this thing where she was like, I'm going to help people. Right. And that was the thing that lit her up as a child and still lights her up. So that's like the story. So we talk about the stories of that, but also what are the word choices that she likes to use when she's talking about that? There was a lot of fire words. There was a lot of lighting up. There was a lot of, igniting. So you can see the choice of words that people use, if you let them talk, will give you clues about what the metaphors are that they should probably focus on. And now her brand logo is like this big campfire. And she, she's got it all figured out. When she first came to me, she was using an airplane analogy. It's like, we're going to take off, and go into the stratosphere. But that wasn't really working for her because it wasn't completely her. You know, it was something that she was trying to make work. So it's important that you think not only about your origin story, which I like to call, you know, your spider bite story. So how did you become Spider-Man, right? What happened, right, to create this? And also, what are the natural word choices that you use to talk about the work that you do and how you feel about it? Yeah. You can go deeper than that. You can start thinking about, what do I like to do when I'm not working? I like to cook and I like to eat. It's a natural thing. So
Right.
I think there's something.
Sorry. Go ahead, Mike.
No, I was just going to pick up on something Téa said about noticing the language, because that can be a clue not just to metaphor but to worldview and how people see themselves interacting in the world, which can help with branding, but also. And so what happened to me is I started working with people on story, and then branched out into transformative work, like transformative coaching too. And Téa, I'd love to hear what your experience. When people start working on their stories, it go like, oh wow, there's a lot of limiting beliefs under there that come out through the stories and the language choices. And so in order to get to the brand identity or to help people promote themselves more effectively, you actually have to start massaging the story a little bit and pointing it out and saying, hey, I can't help but notice that you use, you know, diminutive terms. You say just a lot, like, oh, all I do is just this. I'm like, well, no, that's pretty amazing. So what's the core story? What's that internal story, like Téa, you said earlier, that's driving you to say, oh, I just do this? Because until you address that, it's going to be really hard to be comfortable being visible in the world. So it works. You're working on both levels, right? The external story can't rise until the internal story is consistent with it.
There you go. It's not just one thing, is it? It's not just like this black and white thing where you just say, okay, this is my brand, these are the words I use, and okay, there's my story. It has to be really consistent with what's going on inside too. And I've told this story, there you go, many times in the last couple of years, is that when I was, after my second trip to Peru, I realized how important travel was to me, and that I had been traveling my whole life, and I had been taking risks and exploring in so many ways, in business, in life, in like when I just went back to look at all these, really milestone things in my life, I was an adventurer. Even though I didn't think of myself. I mean, I'm an introvert and all this stuff, but I was really an adventurer. And that's when I started shifting over, because like that was everything. So it was an internal that made me see like I couldn't keep it in anymore at all. Like it was impossible for me not to make the change once I went, oh my God. That's what I'm doing, and so I'm really glad that you brought up, that there's this internal piece that has to be congruent with what's going on outside too, because I think that really helps you buy into your own story, right?
Yeah.
You get rid of the just.
Yeah. Well, if you don't believe your own story, nobody else will,
Right.
No, and people can tell, they can tell when it's contrived and it's not authentic. And that's why you don't want to try and force something that isn't there, but work on to get it there. And then when you think about, okay, what is the vision that we're trying to accomplish? Is that also in alignment with who you are? And can you bridge that with a story, a backstory, a future story? Right. We have all of these different layers. For me, part of telling the story in my business was, making something concrete. So when we talk about storytelling in writing, or even when we're telling a story, the biggest thing to remember is if you can show somebody something and not just tell somebody something, if you can understand the difference between those two, you really can't go wrong. Right. So always, for example, right? let's always give an example of what we're trying to say. And then you are okay. You don't have to get all weirded out about whether or not you're telling a story. It's just, are you giving us examples to show us what you mean? Are those examples relevant to the audience, right? Can they understand them? And then you're good. Mm-hmm. It really is pretty
Show,
simple.
don't tell. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think, we get lost in our heads.
Yes.
I get lost in my head.
Well, we
I
all
try
do.
to make it. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think because we're trained by fancy educations to not trust the power of story, right? Since the Enlightenment, we're dropping some history, right? Since really the rational mind has been ascendant, and it's kind of reached the limits of what it can do alone. So we're seeing, this resurgence of interest in story and storytelling and metaphor, I think in partial response to the fact that our brains are exhausted. And they're trying, because they spin out, okay, do you get it?
Right.
Do you understand what I'm saying? Okay, let me show you another 20 pages of statistics. Do you get it now?
Right.
No, of course not. Whereas if you tell a story, if you show, I do this great exercise in storytelling classes sometimes where I have people describe a time where they experienced an emotion, right? So instead of saying like, oh, I was sad, that doesn't tell me anything. But if you show me that, if you say, I felt a heavy weight in the pit of my stomach, my chest constricted, and I couldn't lift my eyes up off the ground, suddenly we have a picture of how that person experiences sadness.
Yeah, it was very visceral too, because I was like feeling constricted. Yeah. You said that word.
Right. And you can do the same thing, and it's a thing called neural coupling. Like as I was saying, and I'm like, oh yeah, I'm summoning up that emotion, and so if you're listening to me or watching me, you're going to feel it. And you can do the same thing with joy. You can do the same thing with triumph, like all of that. And so if you're able to tie your business to those feelings of joy and excitement of triumph through story, through metaphor, you're doing pretty good.
John made a comment over there, and he was talking about how
he wants to get really political here.
Well, yeah, but I mean, it's important because I think these are tools that could be used for evil.
Yeah,
you're right.
They are value agnostic. It's true.
That's right. And you have to make sure that you say, I'm going to use my superpowers for good.
Yeah.
And no ill intent, right? I mean, sales and marketing can be super misinterpreted by people. If you think I'm trying to sell you something, immediately you're going to be like, no, close off.
Right.
But if I know how to manipulate you by telling you a story and playing on your emotions and get rid through the rational thought, is that okay?
Right.
These are deeper philosophical questions.
Yeah.
Even if I know that what I'm trying to sell you, in my opinion, is exactly what you need.
Well, and this brings up a great point, which is, the one that's coming to mind is Bank of America, which has invested tons of time and money into creating these like beautiful, heartwarming, heart-tugging stories that are softly branded. So people are starting to associate Bank of America with like benevolence, which it's a terrible corporation. I think it's so important that people with good intent learn to tell powerful stories, because there's so many stories out there right now that only the powerful ones can cut through the noise. Right. Only the ones that have, and that I feel like is less a matter of structure and more a matter of authenticity and integrity, because that will read through. I'll forgive a story where the structure is like, it was all right, if I sense that the person is really putting themselves on the line with it. Whereas a beautifully structured story that doesn't have any like blood and tears and sweat in it, whatever, I can get those anywhere.
Okay, yeah. So, you talk about, you use the word powerful. We need to learn how to tell powerful stories. And how do you know? I know these are hard questions, and this is why I've been grappling with this for a while. It's like, what makes it powerful? How do I create something that's, with intent, but that is powerful and authentic at the same time, and doesn't sound contrived, right?
Yeah.
There's the tension, I think.
Well, there is absolutely, Denise. I mean, we watch movies and television shows for the ones that really engage us emotionally, right? We're not going to sit down and waste time on something that's boring. And that also leads to, well, it's a matter of taste. What's boring to you isn't going to be boring to somebody else, vice versa. So understanding what are the existing stories that are out there already, right? Because if we just keep saying the same stories everybody else is saying, that's kind of boring.
Right.
But if you can put a little twist or a little surprise in there, that's where we really perk up. And if you think about it, even in terms of telling a joke, the punchline is why we listen for the punchline, because we know it's going to be different. It's not going to be something we expected. So if you can think about what is it that nobody else is saying that needs to be said, what is a story that I could tell that is super, relevant to me and my audience? And not everything that we do in life, like I go back to my grandma, her having a conversation with her next door neighbor is not necessarily story material because nothing really happened. The two of them had a conversation. They talked about the weather. Nobody had a growth experience, right? Nobody had a transformation there. I don't really need to know that.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, I think that's, the key thing in a story is something's got to shift, or it's just a thing that happened, right? And so there's story structure. There's things like the hero's journey, which is Joseph Campbell's monomyth, which is kind of the template that a lot of these things use. It's one possibility. I think a lot of people lift it up as, oh, you must tell a hero's journey. No, it's just a really popular one. For me, what I always tell people is, once you've mastered the technique of it and the structure, really it's, do you feel uncomfortable at the prospect of sharing it with people? And if you do, there's probably something there. If it's too easy, it's kind of like, then it's probably a story tale, like you said, that other people could tell. But what is the story that only you can tell? And once you tap into that, I mean, you'll be uncomfortable sharing it. You'll get sweaty. You'll probably do anything but work on it. But once you get it out into the world, you'll get a commensurately higher response, because power requires sacrifice, not like human sacrifice or animal sacrifice, but a sacrifice of that part of yourself that resists sharing this deeply held truth with a capital T with people. And so even with, like, especially with branding stories, where one way to, I think you have to come at it both ways, right? One is strategic. Who are you speaking to? What's the competitive landscape? But then there's sort of a more tender-hearted, intuitive side, which is, what is the thing that you need to say in the world that nobody else can say?
Right.
And trusting, sort of, Denise, you're a great example. Your example with the travel and the adventures is an amazing example of that, right? There's nobody else who can express that the way you do. And there was resistance around it. There was all of that.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And when you find,
I didn't even know, I was trying to be, fit into a box for so long of, being a marketing consultant, and looking at going from that direction, and it was boring. Everybody does that. Right. I mean, there's a gazillion people out there who do it,
right. Right. And so what's your unique way of doing it? And then when you tap into it, you overcome that hurdle of fear to share it. There's generally this huge feeling of, like, freedom and liberation, and like, oh my God, I can't believe I let myself live in that box for so long. Box is a great metaphor, by the way, for just sort of picking them out. So yeah, I think both, you need a inside out and outside in approach.
Yeah, we totally understand the box metaphor, and you have to be careful, especially in the business world, of overusing these metaphors. Then they kind of devolve into jargon. That's what we call jargon, because everybody it's a buzzword. So even storytelling is a buzzword. It's
horrible.
It's horrible.
Yeah.
Scott had asked about, is storytelling a two-way street, right? Absolutely. Story listening is such a powerful, it's such a powerful asset for you as a business person, as a human being. If you can sit and listen to somebody without thinking about what you're going to say next, holy cow, right?
Right.
And you really, if you go into a forest and start telling a story and nobody's there.
Did you tell a story?
Right.
I don't know that you're actually telling a story to anybody. So
yeah. And I also think in that listening, learning to listen to these stories critically, not in a, I'm trying to pick it apart way, but in what am I hearing? Right. And realizing that whatever you're hearing is being filtered through your own neural story, and that's being filtered through the lens of your own experiences. And so when you're able to separate those two, it's like, okay, here's what the person's saying. Here's the metaphor they're using. Okay, great. How can I meet this person where they are and find my own story in their story? Suddenly you're building tremendously powerful, durable relationships because you're co-creating a myth together almost.
You're building.
Well, I would say that.
Yep.
Go ahead. Jay.
No, the metaphor, building a bridge. Being able to see your side of the bank and their side of the bank, and where you can go in between.
Right.
I love that.
Well, and what I was thinking when you were saying that, Michael, too, is that listening to, let's say, your customer stories, your client stories, right? As a, coming at it from the business owner perspective, is that you can hear if you can hear what their stories are and their metaphors are, then I think maybe that's what you were saying, is then you can speak to them in their stories too, and how it connects with your stories. I think that's what you're saying. Because, one of the things I learned a long time ago, my former husband was an NLP practitioner, and it was like the meaning of your communication is the response you get. I always thought that was so powerful, because we can't control what somebody hears from us. So we have to be really mindful of how we're communicating. So if we can communicate in the metaphors of our clients and customers also, then that can create that stronger bridge.
Yeah.
There was, you guys know Tad Hargrave from Marketing for Hippies. There was a post on Facebook either yesterday or the day before where somebody commented on his thread and was telling the story about his designer friend who designs products for a living. And when he was in school, his instructor said, you might be designing a hammer, but if you give this tool to somebody and they start using it to open bottles, you haven't designed a hammer. You've designed a bottle opener. Right. And that is a metaphor for the communication, the story. If you communicate something and it's received in a completely different way, it doesn't matter what your intent was. I mean, It is a little bit, but the way it's received is the story that you told.
Right. Exactly. Okay. Well, I think this conversation could go on a very long time. I am loving it. I know there's been a lot of conversation in the sidebar, and I apologize for not bringing you into it more, folks, but I do have one more question. It's more tactical, and because visuals are so hugely important in our marketing today. We've been talking about storytelling and really more the verbal way of telling our stories. And I've been listening to a lot of the words, and it occurs to me that when we need to be creating the visual aspects of our stories, the visual marketing, for example, how do we translate the metaphors that we're talking about, or the stories we're telling, into visual metaphors? I mean, how do you tackle that?
Well, okay. So one of the ways that I usually advise clients is, for example, on your website, you have a brand. Your brand has a theme. The pictures that you choose for your blog posts, for all of your things, should support that theme. So initially when I started my business, every picture was food related. So, reinforce, even to the logo that I have. I use an artichoke. I have a whole story about the artichoke. You know, it's a metaphor for storytelling. The heart is the best part, right? There's layers that you peel off and it needs to be experiential and you share it with somebody. That's the best thing. So if you think about what your theme is, what your metaphors are, you can find pictures that speak to that. So you do this really well too, Denise, with your adventures. So you're picking pictures for your blog posts that speak to that. I'm going to go climb this mountain or whatever the adventure happens to be.
Right.
So I don't think it's really that hard if people, they first understand what their brand is about and or what the story theme is about and the metaphors that they're going to use.
Yeah.
You can use those as search terms in your stock photos. So, you know, I use food or cooking plus another word. It's amazing. Humor, food, you know, whatever. And I get a really crazy, you know, thing that comes back to me. So you'd be surprised what you can find.
Yeah. I think it's interesting. I mean, what I do basically is I partner with agencies and designers and send my clients to them when I'm done with them because I'm not a designer, you know? And I think it speaks to, there's so many different ways to tell stories now. There's pictures, there's video, there's sound, there's whatever. And each one has its own vocabulary, right? So Blab vocabulary is different than Twitter vocabulary, is different than Instagram vocabulary. What I work with people on explicitly is those are ways that you can tell your story. I work with different vocabularies. I'm like, what is the story you need to be telling? Because you can hire someone to do your social media, but if they're not telling the right story because you haven't figured it out yet, you're going to have some really fancy social media that doesn't hit, right?
Right.
And so in TV, they refer to it as a show Bible. Like literally they have a huge book that's filled with every character trait, everything that's ever happened in the show that they draw from. And so what I help people do is create that story Bible for their business and for themselves so that they can pull from it. And it's a great metaphor. So that they can pull from it to tweet, Facebook, whatever, do speaking engagements. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And so that's because I know that comes up as like, well, how do I illustrate this idea? You know, that kind of thing. And I mean, somebody asked in one of my programs, we're in my challenge this month, we're talking about how to tell your story with visuals. And, you know, there was also a method to my madness to having you come on during this challenge period too. I told them they all had to attend. But you know, somebody said, well, how do I illustrate, you know, somebody who's trying to doing everything themselves? And, you know, just reading that, I was like, oh, an octopus with lots of arms, you know, somebody juggling, you know, and that was like just reading her question. And that sort of started telling me, you know, like, okay, my thinking is switching too. Instead of just saying, are you overwhelmed? It's like you show a picture of like, you know, somebody juggling or they're falling or whatever, right? So.
Yeah, it's the keywords that will, if you focus in on those, will help you find a visual that matches that.
Right.
I just want to say I have like 5 minutes and then I have to go speak with a client, but.
Okay, final question, because for both of you, each of you, and Téa, you can go first. What is your most memorable adventure? Because this whole thing's adventure for me, but what is your most, you know, memorable adventure, business, life, whatever?
Oh, Lord. So, you know, usually I have a really bad memory. So the most visceral adventure or thing that I can think of is the one that I'm currently in. Right? And some of you guys know that I started doing this new job on the side to sell life insurance. Holy cow, this is not something that I ever in my wildest dreams said, when I grow up, I want to be a life insurance agent. And it is pushing me in all kinds of different ways. When you get to be 50 years old or maybe even a little older, you start thinking, I got it all figured out. You know, I've been doing this a while. I know how to, no. And, I am finding that the stories I've been telling myself about what I'm capable of or not capable of, or what somebody else wants from me or doesn't want from me, completely different, right? I'll walk into a home and think I'm reading the body language. They don't want me to be here. They think I'm a salesperson. So they're automatically, like, get away.
Mm-hmm.
And after about 5 minutes, they're like, can I have some of that? And, I was ready to give up. I was ready to walk away and be like, well, okay, I guess they didn't want it. So don't underestimate the adventures that you're having as being something that can teach you something really deep about yourself and humanity.
Mm.
Yeah.
Wow, that's great. That's great, because you probably weren't expecting to learn those things about you.
No, I
right?
wasn't. Not at all. It's been good, though.
That's fantastic. That's fantastic. Michael?
So the one that comes up for me is because you mentioned Peru earlier. I was there probably 5 years ago, and I had to leave. I went on a tour through the rainforest, but I had to leave a day early. And they said that they had set up transport for me, but that didn't happen. So I found myself like clinging to a 17-year-old on a motorcycle as we chased tourist buses through the rainforest because I just needed to get to Cusco for like 3 hours. Terrifying. And I was wearing a hat that said Lucky on it. And right at the beginning, as the motorcycle zoomed off, it flew off my head. And I was like, oh, great, I'm going to die in the rainforest. I'm done. But it all ended. I ended up bribing a cab driver to drive for 9 hours out of the rainforest to Cusco. And he agreed to do it. And about halfway through, I realized it was because he was smuggling drugs under my seat. And so we got, the car got tossed by the cops probably 3 or 4 times, but they never bothered me because I was a tourist. And there was a lot of learnings there. Like, don't trust cab drivers in the rainforest who agree to take you in the middle of the night, but also just trust, right? Like, there were so many, because the roads you're on are so narrow, and it would be so easy to panic in these moments where everything kind of goes pear-shaped. But trusting that there is something there to learn and to take away really helped me through it. Just sort of, look, it's a leap of faith. Whether it's a new job or a rainforest adventure. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. Téa, I have posted the link to your business storytelling assessment, which is fantastic.
Yeah, it's
I've been
free.
telling everybody to take that. So if you want to find out what your business storytelling type is or story type is, follow that link to Téa's assessment. Téa, thank you so much for being here with me today.
Thank you for having me.
I know you got to jump off. So this was a great conversation. I could just keep talking, and listening. So thank you so much.
Bye, everybody.
Take care.
Bye,
Michael, where can people find you? Usually I ask the people to tell themselves, but I knew Téa had to leave. So.
Yeah, so you can find me at michaelkass.co. I've got I've got a leadership storytelling e-course on there that's free. Register for it. You'll get, it just sort of takes you through the process of building a story, from identifying the audience, assembling raw material, storytelling tips and tricks. I don't think
I have a link to that, so I'll put it in the show notes for them.
Yeah, I can do this. Here we go.
Okay.
www.michaelkass.co. Just check it out. And then I've got a blab coming up next week with Bill Ratner, who's a master storyteller, and he's also a voiceover. So like listening to him talk is like listening to like warm butter in the. I mean, it's just, he's got a really soothing voice. And he's also an award-winning author. So we're going to be talking about what are the secrets to creating strong stories, why storytelling is so powerful. And that's
okay. Everybody, click Michael's name, the little thing at the top of his. Follow him and you get notified when he's doing that blab. Sure, because that'll be great.
Awesome.
Okay. Well, thank you. I realize I've let this go on for quite a long time, but I really appreciate you being here with me today, Michael and Téa. You've really given me so much food for thought. I've written down like all these little nuggets from you guys. I know I'll be listening to this again because sometimes managing the show, I don't hear everything. Like when I listen again, it's like, oh, totally missed that. But anyway, to let you all know, thank you, who have been here in the audience. I really appreciate your time and attention today. You can sign up to get notification of future Adventures in Visibility at adventuresinvisibility.com. I also share the show as a podcast. You can go to adventuresinvisibilitypodcast.com if you want to sign up for that and hear it on iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher, wherever you want. I try to make it as easy as possible. And thank you so much. Thank you, Michael, again. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Have an adventurous day. All righty, we are off the recording air.
Thank you, Denise. That was super fun.
That was great.
Good.
That was great. I think this is like now one of my favorite shows.
Woohoo.
You two were so great.
Awesome.
And thank you all for being here and asking great questions. I'm sorry I couldn't get to everything, but John, thank you for being here. Deborah, Joselito, Trudy, Soul Broadcasting. I don't know who that is, but thank you for being here. Scott, Linda. Hi, Linda. Nice to see you too. Kim. So anyway.
Awesome. All right.
I'm going to say goodbye now.
Bye. Thank you, Denise. Talk to you later.
Bye-bye.
Bye.